This is a revision presentation on labour market flexibility. Now, just to clear up some terminology to start with, we also talk about the mobility of labour, and these two concepts are very, very similar. For you, for all intents and purposes in Econ 4, you can treat flexibility and mobility of labour as being very, very similar concepts. What they both refer to is the ability of labour to respond to some kind of external change. We consider this on the supply side, so the worker themselves, how much can they actually provide labour, perhaps in different areas, different jobs. And then on the demand side, so let's think about firm behaviour and why firms might demand labour in certain ways. Now, the kind of changes that we're talking about here could be something to do with the pattern of demand, so people start consuming one type of good or service rather than another. It could be to do with the level of demand, by which we mean aggregate demand, so it could be about how labour markets respond to recession. Or it could be some kind of other wider technological change or shock. So our first type of mobility or flexibility we're going to consider is occupational mobility, sometimes described as functional flexibility. Now, this fundamentally boils down to the ability of workers to do different types of jobs. And this is obviously going to have a lot to do with their skills. A worker with a broader range of skills will be able to do a variety of jobs well. A major benefit of this will be that it will help reduce the levels of structural unemployment. Structural unemployment, remember, emerges when there's some change in the pattern of labour demand or some change in the pattern of the economy, and this leaves some people without the right skills to do the available jobs. But if they were occupationally mobile, then they would actually have the skills to do some other kind of job. They wouldn't suffer from their particular industry going into decline. They'd be able to move over to an industry that was perhaps still growing. Now, you may question about whether occupational mobility itself is actually a realistic aim, especially when we consider it in the context of the idea of comparative advantage. With comparative advantage, economies tend to specialise in producing just one type of thing. If they're specialising, then their worker skills are probably likely to be very specialist as well. So actually, occupational mobility and the idea of specialisation within an economy are against each other. The second type of mobility to consider is geographical mobility. It's quite straightforward, as the clue is in the name. It's to do with now the ability of workers to take advantage of where there are different jobs in different areas of the country. So there might be one area of the country that's doing very well, where there are more available jobs, and an area where it's doing less well. Can the workers get to where the available jobs are? Now, two major things that will affect this. One will be the quality of transport. Quality of transport, of course, is very much influenced by government spending on transportation, government spending on infrastructure and roads and things like that. The higher quality of the transport is, the easier it is for a worker to get to where the jobs are. It also, though, might be affected by issues around the housing market. If workers are struggling to gain mortgages, if it's hard for them to access finance for housing, then they can't actually then go and live where the available jobs are. So with transport, we're thinking about how do they commute and actually get there, and perhaps with our housing market, we're thinking about how can they actually relocate and instead base themselves in an area where there are jobs. And one of the useful things about geographical mobility is it tends to reduce regional disparities. This will happen much more if we think a bit on the transport side of things. If someone is commuting to get to somewhere where there are available jobs, but still living back in an original area that's got lower income, then they'll tend to increase the income of that area that they're commuting out of where they actually live. And overall here, we're coming back to a fundamental notion of productive efficiency. The factors of production getting to where they're needed. Next type of flexibility to consider is wage flexibility. What we're referring to here is the ability of wages to adjust to changes in both supply and demand for labour. Now, one thing that might stop wages adjusting how they need to adjust could be some kind of trade union power. So we call this collective bargaining, when workers are negotiating for their wages as a group rather than individually. This gives them more power to demand higher wages. It makes it harder then for firms to reduce their wages. This could also be set up by something like the minimum wage. That might make it difficult for firms to pay their workers the actual equilibrium wage level. And while this is happening, you can think of it as establishing some kind of price ceiling. We're going to have an excess supply of labour. Firms aren't going to be looking to take these workers on because they want to pay them too high wages. Now, when this becomes really important is when we're thinking about the way that economies respond to negative aggregate demand shocks. And if we compare unemployment in the UK, how it changed in, for example, the 1930s compared to the Great Recession in the late 2000s, the unemployment went much higher, much more quickly in the 1930s and in the late 70s recessions in the UK as well. But unemployment in the UK in Great Recession times peaked at just above 8%, relatively actually quite a low level. And what happened instead is we had those big drops in real wages. We had wage flexibility. Firms were, instead of laying off workers, cutting their wages, and that was keeping people in jobs. Next type of flexibility is to do with contractual flexibility. And again, here we're really thinking about the point of view of firms. Contractual flexibility comes back to how easy it is, which is also to do with how costly it is to hire and fire workers. Now, on the hiring side, this makes sense. You don't want to put up barriers to firms taking on new workers, because then they'll do it less and you'll get higher unemployment. But actually, we also think here about the impact of short-term contracts and how that makes it easier for firms. And it might be something like offering a part-time job or a 0 hours contract in order to satisfy firms' worries about level of demand. They'd be willing to take on a part-time worker but not a full-time one because they haven't got that high demand for their product. But it can also be to do with how easy it is to lay off workers. And the reason for that is that if workers are easy to lay off, then firms are more willing to take them on in the first place. And that's because if you take on a worker and find out that they're rubbish, then you want to be able to get rid of them. But if you say to firms, no, you have to keep workers that you take on for a long time, then actually they're going to be quite cautious because they don't want to end up with some worker who's expensive who doesn't actually produce that much for them. Now, that could have some quite important implications with how firms think about training workers who they've already got. If firms are only going to keep workers on for a short period of time, there's a much lower incentive for them to give those workers training. And so this could end up affecting the overall level of skills in the economy, which might come back to some of our ideas around occupational mobility instead. So why do we worry at all about the flexibility of the labour market? Well, actually, it's all about the ability of the economy to deal with external shocks. So think about, for example, the UK in the late 2000s. The UK, an economy where, for example, financial services were really, really important. And the implications initially of credit crisis in 2009 were really a lot to do with financial services. A lot of banks went into big trouble, and so workers in financial services had to be laid off. Now, if those workers could then go and get jobs in some other area, it makes things not so bad. If they can't find jobs in another area, then they become unemployed. We have negative multiplier effects. There's consequences for the government as well. On a broader sense, and this is where the UK did quite well, as I was talking about earlier in the late 2000s, that it can actually make the effects of recession less severe. If you keep people in jobs, then that means that actually they won't have no income. They might have a lower income, but they'll still have some kind of income. And that helps in terms of not creating a severe negative multiplier effect. But there's also implications for the government. It's a very good thing for the government not to have to pay out unemployment benefit, and they won't have to pay out unemployment benefit if people are just having their wages cut instead. But we shouldn't forget this, right, that actually we still have in this situation falling real wages. And the interesting thing here is that can have implications for the budget deficit as well. We look at how in the UK in recent years income tax receipts have been lower than expected, and that I think is partly to do with wages falling because of the wage flexibility in the UK. Another benefit in terms of having this flexibility will be the attitude of foreign companies towards your country. Firms like to operate in flexible labour markets because it allows them to produce efficiently, because they don't have to overpay workers on the basis of minimum wage. They don't have to keep them on for too long. So it will make your country quite attractive to foreign direct investment, that's what we call FDI, if you have a flexible labour market. Firms will come in and set up stuff in your country. They'll buy capital and increase the productive potential of your country. However, there are some negative implications here. We could consider, for example, how wage mobility, which could be achieved from reducing trade union power, could result in workers being underpaid. And here you can use microeconomic concepts to quite a good effect. If you think of, for example, of firms that might be operating as a monopoly with respect to labour demand, actually there could be really big implications in terms of workers being under. There might be a good reason there to reduce flexibility by having trade union power. You also think about this in terms of inequality. If workers are being paid low wages, then actually we're going to see lots of concentration of money in rich people who are owners of business, and not so much income going towards workers who are earning money through wages.